Hi, everyone. My name is Man in the Wall,
And I'm Veritas et Caritas.
and welcome back to our weekly podcast, of which we still have to decide a name. I guess we probably really got to work on that. Maybe we'll talk about that after we're done with the show today.
Sure.
But that's not what we're here for. We're here to talk about political issues that we think you all will be interested by. And today, we decided to focus on something that we've actually been talking a little bit about for a while: ethno-nationalism, specifically in the context of historically and currently oppressed people trying to have self-determination when it is and when it is not legitimate, and how we should go about it in the best way. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yep, that's correct.
So I guess we should first talk about like what kind of started all of this for us. It was probably when, this debate's kind of been going on for a while, particularly because of Vaush debates with people like Professor Flowers and with other indigenous rights activists who argue for things like land back, and when people argue about what exactly that means and whether or not it's legitimate, which I think is an interesting argument. And we've been talking about it for a while, and I think we more or less have about the same position. But I figure today we'll talk about it and go over it just as we go over everything else we like talking about, more or less. You want to go first, Veritas, or should I?
Yeah, you can go first. I'd like to get this from your perspective.
So first, let's start out with like some basic points that I think everyone on either side of this debate can more or less agree to. There are certain groups, particularly in places like the United States, Canada, Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, places that have been historically colonized, that have gone through severe social and economic stigmatization and oppression that, although not as severe as it once was, does still continue in various ways to this day. In America, the main examples of these are the Native Americans and African Americans. Canada has many similar issues with indigenous peoples, as does Australia and New Zealand with the Aborigines and the Maori. It definitely is still, even in the countries like New Zealand, where it's a little bit better, it is still a big problem. But people obviously have different ways of handling it. Some people who advocate for particularly indigenous rights, and also some people who advocate for more civil rights for African Americans, have argued that because of the way in which these people have been exploited throughout history, the best way, the solution to that problem is for essentially these people to have their own nation state. Not necessarily an ethno-state per se, but they want some kind of ethnic sovereignty, more or less. And this varies from person to person you ask. Some people might say, we want our own independent nation. Some people just want more sovereignty, like in terms of like an ethnic sense. Some people full on want to like basically create like an ethno-state and kick out like settlers or whatever. That's a bit more of a fringe, but they do exist. It's not just a straw man. And people have various opinions on this. I imagine you would agree with that, Veritas, more or less?
Yep, very definitely.
Okay, so my perspective on this is that it is certainly true that African Americans and indigenous Americans have suffered horribly under the boot, I guess, of white supremacy and racism and all that other such stuff, and that it definitely is something that needs to be remedied. I do understand the argument that some people make that they would like to have more sovereignty, and I think that that's fine. However, I would like it to be done theoretically within the purview of a multi-ethnic democratic society. I like the fact that America is a multi-ethnic democratic society where different people coexist even if everything isn't perfect. And I would like it so that, like, as we continue to strive for a more egalitarian society, we also keep that ideal in mind. I don't think that creating some kind of like separate black nation state or indigenous nation state would be particularly good for natives, because they'd still be reliant on the US economy, and the economy would worsen because they're operating from a separate state as opposed to in the greater purview of the American economic empire. It'd be bad for everyone else because they'd be losing key economic areas. It'd be bad for the world because a lot of the world's economy is plugged into the US economy. I just don't think it's the right solution. I think a better solution would be to try and strive for more egalitarian policies, whether that be less bias in the criminal justice system or trying to erode biases in housing or like job discrimination, or making it so that African Americans have more of an access to the ballot than they do because we have issues with things like voter suppression here in America, or also perhaps doing things like ending the war on drugs and trying to treat drug addiction like what it is, which is a public health crisis as opposed to a criminal justice crisis. I think that those are the things to strive for. And I also believe, maybe it's just because I'm a bit more optimistic, but these things can be done within the United States framework. I don't necessarily believe that the United States is inherently colonialist and like racist and imperialist, and it can never not be those things. I think that far from it. I think we could fairly easily, with certain policies in mind, change this country for the better so that we are more egalitarian and less xenophobic. I imagine you agree with most of that, Veritas, but still I'd be interested to hear from your perspective.
I think this issue raises a lot of completely unwarranted fear in the minds of people who are either descendants of colonizers or even immigrants, as we actually saw recently in a video by the YouTube channel Dr. Heem Doubt, who not only had a discussion with Professor Flowers himself, but also commented on the issue and discussed it with other people afterwards. He declared his unease with terms like land back and suggestions of black nationalism or ethno-nationalism, saying that this kind of language made him, as an immigrant, feel, as he says, unwelcome, makes it feel like he doesn't belong in this place, that this can never be his home. I think those are unwarranted concerns, and I think that there is a lot of scaremongering generated by bad faith people and bad actors taking advantage of misunderstandings of what self-determination means. Having said that, at this point, I think we need to differentiate between concepts such as ethno-nationalism, an ethno-state, separatism, nationalism, self-determination. All of these terms tend to get conflated, and they aren't all the same. In fact, there's even a difference between ethno-nationalism and an ethno-state. There are different definitions of what constitutes an ethno-state. And I think that failure to differentiate sufficiently and consistently between these definitions was seen repeatedly in Vaush's debate with Professor Flowers, in which Professor Flowers was consistently making an effort to differentiate between these different concepts. And Vaush, while he was explicitly declaring that he understood they are different, in actual practice as he was debating, I believe he kept on conflating them. So I'd like to get your understanding of the differentiation between these concepts: ethno-nationalism, ethno-state, separatism or ethno-separatism, nationalism, and self-determination.
An ethno-state, in my view, would be a country where at least a certain ethnicity of people are either A, the only people who are allowed to live in that society, or B, there is an extremely high level of bias and favoritism as far as certain ethnicities being let in. So, for example, Japan is not a pure ethno-state. They don't exclude all immigrants from coming in, but there is definitely a high bias towards immigrants from other countries and a large level of ethno-nationalism and a sense that, Japan should be for the Japanese or whatever. And so I guess by that sense, you could probably say that Japan would be like a light ethno-state. Ethno-nationalism, in my view, would probably be the idea of a certain ethnicity saying that they should have independence and autonomy. This is not always a bad thing. For example, I would say that during the collapse of Yugoslavia, the Bosnians wanting their own Bosnian state was probably reasonable. Same with the Bengalis when they rose up against Pakistan. Or I'm trying to think of other examples, but there are definitely quite a few. I think more or less this can be reasonable. However, ethno-nationalism can come with a lot of ugly side effects, namely the fact that it can be at times quite xenophobic towards other people who are not
Right.
part of that main group. I mean, we saw this to some extent with the way that the Hmong people were treated in Laos after the Laotian monarchy fell, and the Hmong were kind of seen as like a traitorous people who allied themselves with America against the new government. Separatism, in my view, would be like the idea that one ethnic group, like, or not even an ethnic group, it could be a religious group, it could be just a group, really, in a state, decides to separate itself from everyone else, usually in the form of creating a different state. This doesn't even necessarily have to be ethnic. Like, you could say that the American Revolution was a separatist action as the United States was trying to be separate from the United Kingdom. That wasn't like ethnic thing. It had to do with differences in ideology and how they wished to govern their society. Nationalism, in my view, would probably be the idea that a certain group needs to have their own nation. In a lot of ways, nationalism and separatism are kind of one and one, as far as I'm concerned. Again, it doesn't have to be ethnic. Like, if all of the LGBT people in like West Hollywood all came together and said, we're going to have our own gay ethno-state, then that would probably be some form of like separatism and or nationalism. That just doesn't really tend to happen because I guess LGBT people just kind of aren't really interested in that by and large. And then self-determination would be, I think, the idea that a certain group of people have the right to collectively determine their own future and the way that they live their lives and govern themselves, in a sense. That would be my definition of all those things. Would you agree with that more or less, or would you disagree?
Yeah, I'm just going to present some differentiation between these concepts. I'll start with nationalism. Obviously, nationalism is the idea of founding a nation based on some common characteristics of the individuals making up the nation. Now, those common characteristics may be a shared culture or maybe a shared history. It's when the characteristics are identified as predominantly ethnic or racial that we move into ethno-nationalism. Now, ethno-nationalism is the concept of a nation being built either specifically for the benefit of a specific ethnic group, or the concept of nationhood arising within an ethnic group for itself, to differentiate itself from others, not necessarily in an exclusionary way, and that's what differentiates it from separatism. And an ethno-state can be either a state which is dominated by one specific ethnic group to the expense of other ethnic groups, or it may be a state which requires a specific ethnicity in order to be a member of that state. So there, you might say, hard and soft ethno-states. I would say a hard ethno-state is a state which requires ethnicity to be identified with the state and to enjoy certain privileges such as citizenship. A soft ethno-state would be a nation like Japan, which comprises predominantly a very, not exactly one single ethnic group, but a very narrow range of historically closely associated ethnic groups, which are dominant and which are permanently in power, to the expense of, but not the exclusion of, other ethnic groups. Now, I would say that to some extent, Taiwan itself is an ethno-state. There is a Han population here, which is not technically the dominant population in terms of population. And in fact, the colonizers who invaded Taiwan in 1949 with the Kuomintang army, they and their descendants comprise only around 15% of the population. However, they do represent the socio-cultural and definitely political elite. They are in charge of the country to the expense of other ethnic groups. So from that perspective, Taiwan itself is an ethno-state. China is absolutely an ethno-state, dominated by the Han Chinese ethnic group, which has historically practiced Han chauvinism, explicitly the idea that the Han people are unique and that they have a special place in the world. Han chauvinism is basically akin to American exceptionalism and the concept of American manifest destiny. Han chauvinism itself is not even implicitly xenophobic, it is explicitly xenophobic, and it has been seen throughout history in a number of different ways. Even during the Maoist era, Mao himself was particularly concerned about Han chauvinism potentially damaging the unity of the nation that he was trying to create. So in the 1950s, he issued a couple of public statements severely condemning Han chauvinism and insisting on ethnic unity. Han chauvinism has been used since the Maoist era, the Dengist and post-Dengist era. Certainly in the Xi Jinping era, Xi Jinping deliberately stokes the fires of Han chauvinism in order to promote a kind of Chinese exceptionalism and to stir up nationalist sentiment in support of the government and in opposition to China's foes or perceived foes on the world stage. So I would say that Taiwan is an ethno-state in that regard. A specific ethnicity is not required for citizenship, but the country is dominated politically and economically by a specific ethnic group to the expense of other ethnic groups. The same goes for China, and the same also goes for a number of other countries, especially colonized countries, I would say including Australia in that sense. Now, there's another definition of an ethno-state, a state the population of which is predominantly one ethnic group. Now, that's a very loose definition, and that's kind of the softest form of ethno-state. It doesn't necessarily mean that other ethnic groups are disadvantaged, although typically they are. So, for example, a number of African nations, and certainly many Asian nations, would be considered ethno-states in that regard, simply by virtue of having a very, very homogeneous population. A specific ethnicity is not required to become a member of the state or citizen of the state. However, the population is predominantly one specific ethnic group or very narrow range of historically closely associated ethnic groups. In this regard, even though there may not be an intentional plan to marginalize or disadvantage other ethnic groups, in practice that is what happens. So from that point of view, I think this third definition really folds into the second definition of a soft ethno-state. I would differentiate in that way between a soft ethno-state and a hard ethno-state. And ethno-nationalism is the concept of attempting to build a nation, as I said, the membership of which is exclusively a specific ethnic group or very narrow range of historically closely associated ethnic groups. Separatism is a concept of a particular group, typically an ethnic group, declaring its intention to withdraw socially from other ethnic groups. And of course, you can call this what it is segregation. I know some people prefer to use the term segregation for a forced separation, that is a separation practiced on people against their will. But I believe that any form of separation which even actively or passively has the aim of dividing one group of people from another is by definition segregation. You can talk about the amount of force required, but if actions are taken either passively or actively to achieve that goal, then it's still segregation. So yes, for example, there have been black separatists in American history. Marcus Garvey was famously a black nationalist, an ethno-nationalist, and of course a black separatist, and ironically collaborated with the KKK, who had a similar aim of separationism or separatism. And of course, Garvey believed that Africans in America should return to the continent of Africa where he believed they belonged and separate themselves completely from white people with whom he believed they could not live in harmony for fairly obvious reasons, considering the era in which he grew up. So yeah, I would differentiate between ethno-nationalism, ethno-state, separatism, nationalism, and self-determination in those ways. There are some scholarly definitions that we could use. I might even cite them a bit later, but for the purpose of our discussion right now, I think this will do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think those definitions are ones I more or less agree with. I wanted to go back a little bit to what you said about the one guy talking to Professor Flowers, and he said, as an immigrant, like land back kind of made him uncomfortable because it felt like he wasn't welcome there or whatever, right? In America.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I'll admit I haven't seen the video that you're talking about, so I don't know the exact context. But one thing that I do think is kind of interesting is I've talked with a lot of people who, they talk a lot about the concept of people who are like sort of land back style nationalists, they talk a lot about the idea of people being settlers, of people being like colonizers. But the weird thing is, when I ask people about like who is defined as a settler and who isn't, a lot of times their definitions are kind of overly broad and often are not exactly the same. Like, obviously, there are some people who undeniably qualify as settlers. Like, if you were one of the people who originally came on the Mayflower and settled Plymouth Rock, or were descendants of maybe some of the Catholics that arrived in Maryland, or the Presbyterians in Pennsylvania, or the Puritans in New England, or just one of the, what were they called, the mercantile trade companies in Virginia. Like yeah, you're a colonizer, you're a settler, pretty much by definition, or at least you're a descendant of such. But like take example for me, I'm at least partially descendant from Irish immigrants to America. I don't really know if you could say that Irish immigrants, like Irish Americans, qualify as settlers, because most of them left during the potato famine, when basically their only options were to get on a boat and leave for America or starve. Like, I don't think that is in any way equivocable. Americans who moved from Italy to America because they were desperately poor, or a lot of the immigrants, the European immigrants following World War One. You know, the Polish Americans, the Russian Americans, a lot of the Polish and Russian Jews that came to escape a lot of the oppression that they faced under the boot of anti-Semitic regimes, like the Russian Empire or the German Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Like technically these people are white people, but they don't qualify as settlers in the same way. And yet, generally, when people talk about settlers, they usually just mean white people in general, and not, for example, English or Scottish Americans who came in the early half of the century. I even once asked, there was a Korean American Marxist-Leninist, and I asked, well, you know, you're an immigrant to America. Like, are you a settler? And he said yes. But then I asked, like, would a Chinese American who came during the 1840s, during the gold rush, are they a settler? To someone else who believed in this kind of stuff. And they said no, because they're not white. I mean, there's not really that much of a difference between like Chinese Americans who came during the gold rush or like Irish Americans who came during the potato famine as far as their material conditions. The only difference is the way that we look at them now. I don't know, that just doesn't make sense to me when people talk about, like, you know, the idea of settlers and decolonization. Like, that's something that we have to establish, like who qualifies as a settler and who does not. Would you agree?
Absolutely. In fact, this was an issue which was raised in Professor Flowers' exchange with Vaush. The question of who is a settler or who is a colonizer. Obviously, if we're going to raise the discussion of what should the colonized people do with their colonizers in the present day, the question must be answered, who is a colonizer? And of course, at that point, the discussion between Professor Flowers and Vaush became rather tangled. Now, obviously, Vaush didn't feel like people who immigrate to Australia should be treated as in the same category as people who originally colonized North America. And I don't believe Professor Flowers believed that they should be in the same category either. However, there is a sense in which Professor Flowers appears to believe that both of them are colonizers, in a different sense, but are colonizers in a sense. I believe, and I will check the video and I'll add some of the clips from that exchange to our video later on to illustrate this.
Somebody in my chat makes a good point. I mean, you also profit off colonialism. You are American, I assume.
Yes, I'm American, but I still have to deal with racism. Like, there's ways you can profit off of it, but I find racism and colonialism to be extremely oppressive.
Well, you can't be like, oh, it's okay for me to be a colonizer if I'm also a victim of racism, can you? If you want to like go out and
no, this is why I'm saying, like, indigenous people, like, in my opinion, I think that they should like decide what to do with their own land, and I don't think that's just in regards to white people. Yeah, I think there is a lot of gray area. I think the thing that I'm getting at is that white people still directly benefit off of colonialism. And, you know, Vaush made the argument that we all do, but also at the same time, like, other people who are non-white are still oppressed by racism, which is a result of colonialism. I think
but both of those can happen at the same time, right? You can have everybody's lives improving, but there's still like it used to be like that here and now it's here, but there's still a set gap between those two.
Yeah.
So I guess like
I agree.
Yeah.
So
So what about like a black person from England moving here?
I don't necessarily think that they're like necessarily colonizers and that they're benefiting from colonialism. And when I say like colonizers, that's what I'm talking about, is people being able to reap the direct benefits of colonialism. But at the same time, if you asked indigenous people, like, what do they think about someone like a black person moving from the UK or things like that? Again, I don't think they would want to kick that person out or even kick the white people out necessarily. But I think it comes down to this being their land and asking, what should we do with this? And again, they're not really talking about kicking anyone out. But I think at the end of the day, like even me as a black person living here, I wonder, like, I still would like to ask indigenous people, like, what do you think about me being here? Or
I feel like even if I was a white person, okay, even if I was from England and I came here, I wouldn't call myself a colonizer. I would agree that I would be a white person who benefits from white supremacy, but I don't think that would make me a colonizer. I'm just as much, I'm an immigrant. Like, I don't know. I guess I don't know what and you said you hadn't thought about it that much, how the immigrant plays into this. I think that there's so much individual movement of people now that like it's really hard to say who exactly is a colonizer unless you just say like, oh, all white people are colonizers because they benefit from a system that colonization set up, which caused white supremacy.
Well, for me, it's like the way that I use the term colonizer is about like the white people who are directly benefiting from a colonialist system, and that's how I throw that word around. And if you don't understand it as that, that's fine. It's not like a hill I'm willing to die on. You know, it's not like an academic term that I'm trying to use. I think it's just kind of like a shorthand way of me being, yeah, white people benefit from colonialism. White people are still very much a colonialist problem, and colonization never stopped happening.
Gotcha. What I'm saying is Obama a colonizer? You know, that's what I'm asking you, is like, how white do you have to be a colonizer? It's like such tough questions to ask, right?
I think it's like white.
Oh, you're back. Sorry.
I think it's like white in passing, where it's like if you can get like the full benefits of white supremacy and not have to face the oppressions of white supremacy, for me, that's when I'd be like, calling you a colonizer. I don't see that as an academic term. I just say that like you're benefiting off of colonialism. That's what I mean by that. And maybe I should use something else because it's very confusing to people. But at the same time, I'm not really interested in, like breaking it down for people either.
Sure.
I believe she said that a colonizer is somebody who benefits from the colonization of the indigenous people, not necessarily somebody who was an active participant in the original colonization, settlement, and subjugation of the indigenous land and its people, but somebody who is a non-native, is non-indigenous, is raised in that colonized region, or later immigrates to that colonized region and benefits specifically from the structures put in place by the colonizers. Now, of course, Vaush promptly asked her if she believed that she was a colonizer, insofar as she, even as a black woman in the USA, benefits significantly from certain structures which have been put in place by the original colonizers. And she said, yes, there is a sense in which she believes she is a colonizer, at least from that perspective as well. I think that was surprising to Vaush, but he attempted to take advantage of it, saying that, well, so you believe that the indigenous people have the right to decide your fate and what to do with you. And again, being consistent, Professor Flowers said yes, which I thought was intellectually very honest. Now, at this point, of course, we need to try and disentangle this issue of who is a colonizer and in what sense they are a colonizer, especially if we're going to answer the question of what should the colonized people do with their colonizers in present day. As you said, I believe, and as others have said, Vaush, of course, definitely said, it is common these days to conflate colonizer with white, And I believe there are people, yes, out there who believe that only white people can be colonizers, right? Colonization is something that white people do, other people don't do it. I think that's incredibly reductive. I don't think that's intellectually honest. That seems to me to be actually more rhetorically motivated. And the entire issue of African empires, for example, not to mention the very complex interrelationship of colonization in Asia, where, of course, the Chinese have attempted to colonize the Japanese, historically definitely colonized areas in Thailand and Vietnam, and especially Korea and other areas. And of course, the Han attempted to colonize pretty much everybody. The Manchu attempted to colonize many people. They pushed out the borders of the Qing Dynasty Empire. It was called an empire for a reason. So historically, of course, there have been non-white colonizers. Another issue as well, I think, is that some people tend to use the term white as an ethnic marker. I think some people believe that there is an ethnic group called white, which I think is entirely unjustified. And again, I think that's constructed mainly for rhetorical reasons. But getting back to the idea of who is a colonizer and who isn't, you mentioned the Irish people who moved to North America as a result of the Irish famine. And of course, there's a question of what we should call these people. Should we call them immigrants? Should we call them economic migrants? Or should we, in fact, even refer to them as refugees? Now, if we are going to say that a definition of a colonizer is somebody who benefits from the power structures and the socio-economic structures put into place by an original settler-colonist group, then yes, the Irish people absolutely did benefit from those existing structures, even though, yes, historically there was a period during which Irish people themselves were not considered white and so didn't benefit from all of those privileges. However, they were not enslaved as the African people were. So there was a differentiation made between them and the African people. And as much as you see all these memes about Irish slavery and how the Irish were enslaved like black people in America, and they don't complain about it, with the obvious insinuation that black people shouldn't complain about being enslaved in America, which is gratuitously offensive. The fact is that Irish people, regardless of whether you want to describe their position, and in particular the very pecunious position of Irish migrants who were basically compelled into extreme forms of indentured servitude, which were little better than slavery in terms of conditions and compensation. The fact is they were never subjected to the chattel slavery to which Africans were subjected. And later on, as Irish people in the national United States consciousness became white, for want of a better phrase, they benefited increasingly from the structures put in place by the original white settler colonizers. So if we want to say that a colonizer is anybody who benefits from colonization, then yes, immigrants are colonizers, and it doesn't matter what ethnic group they belong to, they are all colonizers. Now, this also raises the issue of in what sense are they colonizers? And here I think we need to differentiate between what we could call active colonizers and passive colonizers. The original settler colonizers who subjugated the indigenous people, deprived them of their land, and instituted socio-economic structures and power structures, authority structures, structures of hierarchy and violence, which were intended to benefit the settler colonizers themselves, we could call them active colonizers. And then anybody else later who benefits from those structures, regardless of their ethnic group, and even regardless of the extent to which they benefit from those structures. Remember, we're talking about them benefiting from those structures in a way that other ethnic groups, in particular the indigenous people, do not. We could call them passive colonizers. So that would include Irish immigrants. It would include people like Dr. Heem, and it would include also, ironically, ultimately, it would include African descendants of slavery, who, although originally did not benefit from any of the structures of the original settler colonizers, now, and in particular increasingly since the civil rights movement, absolutely do. And to a certain extent, it has to be acknowledged that even today, African descendants of slavery benefit from those structures put into place by the original settler colonizers to an extent to which certainly indigenous people in North America do not. It's, for example, it's not the indigenous people who are seen going to Harvard and other Ivy League colleges, getting all these degrees, being represented significantly in the legislature and in the positions of socio-economic power. So from that perspective, I believe that if we're going to take that definition of passive colonizers as valid, then Professor Flowers is right to say, yes, she is a colonizer, and I admire her intellectual honesty for saying that. So I think it's important to differentiate between active colonizers and passive colonizers. Now, I'm just going to pause there for a moment and get some feedback from you.
Yeah, I more or less agree with that. I think maybe passive colonizer might not be entirely the right word. Maybe I would just say someone who maybe indirectly benefits from colonization. I know that's not quite as catchy, but
yeah, we can play with terminology. Obviously, I'm not very good at this kind of thing,
by that logic, whether like different ethnic European groups could qualify under that. Most Asian Americans could probably also qualify under that. Asian Americans and like Polynesian Americans, even to some extent. To a lesser extent, you could argue African Americans or even like white Hispanics, you could say. I mean, definitely them because of their history in Latin America, for instance. One thing that is kind of interesting, though, is you also have to consider when we're talking about colonizers, people of mixed race. Like here's an example. I have a friend named David. He's mixed race. By most people's standards, they'd say he's African American. His dad is an immigrant from Senegal, and his mother is descended from some of the first people to ever colonize America, like people who were on the Mayflower, more or less. Even my roommate, Alex, his mom is a Mexican American, and his dad is white American who has like old school English descendants all the way back to this country's founding. But if you were to look at most of them, they'd say that David is black and Alex is Hispanic, even though technically they're like 50% descendant from colonizers. They wouldn't really be considered in the same league, at least by a lot of people who make these kind of like settlers style arguments. If we're going off more like passive colonization, then both of them qualify. But if not, then we're just going by like whoever's arbitrarily designated as white or black or Latino or Asian. They aren't. So I think that's also something that you should definitely keep in mind as well. And while this argument definitely is interesting, in my opinion, and I think it's worth bringing up, what's more interesting is like the idea of what should colonized people do with, I guess you could broadly say they're colonizers, but I guess or either they're colonizers or people who benefit from colonization. So my idea broadly would be, at least for indigenous Americans, to perhaps, I definitely am open to the idea of paying some kind of reparations to them. I think that allowing them to live on their land while also making sure that they are in the fold, as it were, that they're given proper economic assistance, and that these reservations are like decent and pleasant places to live. I might be in favor of giving some kind of land back to Native people, though I wouldn't be in favor of like saying, like, for example, recently half of Oklahoma became tribal land. I wouldn't be okay with like, okay, all of Oklahoma, that's like native land now. All you like white and black people, you guys need to leave. I would not be in favor of that, because that's ethno-nationalism, and we're both opposed to that. And that gets into the thing that I'm not in favor of. I would not be in favor of like kicking people out who are colonizers, full stop. I don't even care if if the colonized people want that. Like even if they do, I still think it's wrong. I know Professor Flowers has said, well, that's up to them. And, if they want to make that decision, that's their business. Like, no, I flatly reject that. That to me is almost, it's not exactly the same, but it's almost like saying like let's say in Europe, if they wanted to kick out all of the migrants from the Caribbean or from the Middle East or from Africa, well, it's their country, so they technically have the right to do that. Like, no, fuck that. People who live there, even people who are just direct descendants of colonizers, no one who engaged in colonization is alive today. The people who are alive are descendants of people who did that, and they're not responsible for the crimes that their ancestors committed. For most of these people, they've lived there let's take America, like English or German or Irish or Asian or even African Americans. They've lived here their whole lives. They're American as apple pie, frankly. Like this is their home. America, as much as I have issues with it, like America is my home, and I would never accept, like, if Indigenous people said, hey, you kind of have to leave now, like you have to go off to live in Ireland. It's like, no, fuck that. I'm staying right here. And I don't think that's acceptable under any circumstances. But I think we should try to make efforts to make sure that we compensate people who have been wronged by colonization properly, and make sure that justice is done for the mistakes of the past, and they are compensated for what happened properly. That's more or less my position.
No, I would agree with most of that, and I just want to identify a few areas of disagreement and qualification. I myself online am frequently identified as a colonizer, particularly by people who are non-white, as soon as they know that I am white. Obviously, most of the time it's a rhetorical strategy. But what's more important to me is that insofar as people do this, they typically demonstrate not only ignorance of my personal background, but I think, again, ignorance of concepts like colonization itself. For example, I've had, of course, Indian nationalists who are, let's just say, fairly strident in their language towards anybody who isn't an Indian nationalist, or in fact isn't an Indian at all. I've had them refer to me as a colonizer. As soon as, of course, they know I'm white and they know that I'm Australian, they call me a colonizer of Australia and a descendant of convicts. Now, that just demonstrates, apart from anything else, an incredible lack of knowledge of Australian history, since obviously immigrants in Australia are not all white, and even white immigrants in Australia are not all descendants of convicts. Now, I wouldn't really care if I was a descendant of a convict anyway, but even if I was, you could hardly call my convict ancestors colonizers in the same way that you could hardly call black African slaves forced to come to America by slavers colonizers. Okay, they didn't go there voluntarily. They were literally forced at gunpoint. And of course, convict settlers or convicts, immigrants, whatever you want to call them, in Australia could hardly be called colonizers in the sense of going there with their own volition, or subjugating the native people, since they didn't. They had no capacity to do so. They were literally locked up. Now, the other irony, of course, is that even though I was born in Australia, I was actually born to immigrants myself. I'm only second generation Australian on my father's side. He was a first generation immigrant. And I'm third generation immigrant on my mother's side. She was born in Australia, but her family were immigrants too. So I actually have no historical connection with Australia. I considered it my home when I was there, but I never identified with the nation. In fact, my parents themselves were very anti-nationalist and took great pains to avoid instilling in their children any sense of nationalism or patriotism. And I think that was right. I mean, I was raised in a Christian anarchist family, basically. So I don't even have a historic legacy of ancestry in Australia myself. Now, apart from that, having left Australia, I am now a first-generation immigrant in Taiwan. So I'm an immigrant again, an immigrant first generation this time, rather than second generation. Now, I'm also in the position of having no political franchise in any nation. I've been out of Australia so long that I no longer have a political franchise in Australia, and I don't have any political franchise in Taiwan, obviously, since I'm not a citizen. So, am I a colonizer in Taiwan? Was I a colonizer in Australia? I was a colonizer in Australia under the definition of anybody who benefits from structures of colonization is a colonizer, and I am a colonizer in Taiwan under the same definition, even though the structures which were established by the Han Chinese settler-colonizers of Taiwan were certainly not set up to benefit me or my ethnic group. They were, in fact, specifically intended to benefit the Han Chinese ethnic group. So, to the question of what should be done with colonizers, it gets back to the question of who colonizers are. And I want to push back a little bit on your comment on historic colonizers as opposed to current colonizers. And you said that, yes, the original colonizers, I agree, the original settler colonizers have all died out, and they are no longer exercising the violence over the indigenous people and the Aboriginal people that they once did.
Well, hang on.
However, they did leave sorry, go ahead.
I didn't say that there aren't still structures of oppression against colonized people in America. What I meant by that was that there is that, like, none of the people who are alive today, who are the descendants of colonizers, I don't believe that these people necessarily bear the responsibility of the crimes of their ancestors, unless they are in some way partaking or participating in some kind of system that is directly leading to harm to indigenous people. Like,
right.
I don't know what an exact example would be, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I did understand you to be saying that. I didn't think that you were saying there were no post-settler colonist oppressive structures anymore. I totally recognize you said that. And yes, I was getting to the point that you mentioned just now, the idea of, are there any people who are actively attempting to apply political pressure or political violence on the indigenous or Aboriginal people in the way that the original settlers did? So yeah, I believe that there are, for example, there are people in Taiwan who are still attempting to disenfranchise the indigenous people through political means in the same way as the original settler colonizers. And of course, there are definitely still people in the United States who are still attempting to disenfranchise the indigenous people of North America in the same way as the original colonizers. However, of course, in both cases, yes, they're a minority. So there are still, I would say, active colonizers in that sense. However, the vast majority of the people, even descendants of the original active colonizers, don't fit into that definition. They fit into our passive colonizer definition. When it comes to the question of what to do about colonizers, I believe that since we have two different groups of colonizers, they should be treated differently. Do colonized people have the right to live apart from their colonizers? I believe yes. I'm not particularly happy with the language of rights. As an anarchist, I'm more keen on the concept of obligations and responsibilities than on rights. But under the concept or structure of a rights-based system, standard, say, Western liberal democracy in a rights-based paradigm, in the sense of those kind of rights, I would say yes. I don't believe that any group has the right to perform any action which constitutes a generally agreed on crime against humanity. So I would definitely agree that no group, regardless of how oppressed they've been, has the right to perform anything which would be called a genocide. And of course, forced displacement of a large group of people, that would certainly, in most instances, qualify as a genocide. But do colonized people have the right to live apart from their colonizers? Yes, I believe they do. And if we want to move to the question of, do black people in America have the right to live separate from the people who oppress them? Because, of course, we couldn't really call black people in America a colonized people. From an anarchist perspective, I don't think it's easy to make an argument against a group of people who live separate from others, unless by doing so, they are actively oppressing another group or depriving another group. Now, I mention this because there was a debate that Vaush had some time ago with a white separatist, and the white separatist very astutely, I believe, observed that from an anarchist perspective, it was extremely difficult for Vaush to argue against ethnic separatism. Because he said, well, what if an anarchist community wants to just go off and live by themselves, and they just want only members of their own ethnic group to be part of that community? And Vaush had great difficulty attempting to construct an anarchist argument against this, given that anarchists typically believe very strongly in the autonomy of the individual and the autonomy of the community. And at the same time, there's a tension between the anarchist belief in the autonomy of an individual and autonomy of the community, and the belief in the idea that there should be no borders. And I think Vaush did very badly in that particular debate because he was genuinely stymied by that dilemma. So, do colonized people have the right to live apart from their colonizers? Yes, insofar as they are not oppressing anybody else or depriving anybody else in order to do so, which, it has to be said, I believe in most cases, they definitely would not be doing. Now, has this happened? Yes, it has. In fact, in Taiwan, there is a group, I know know that I've mentioned this before. I have a couple of videos on this particular group. There's a community called Galangs Mangus in Taiwan, which is an indigenous Christian anarchist community of about 200 people, which has been around for about 18 years now. And it is an ethnic community, specifically an indigenous ethnic community belonging to one particular tribe of one particular ethnic group. So the people in that community all belong to the, in Chinese, Taiyazu, in the original language, Taiyan. In English, we would say the Atayal people. So they are one particular group of the Atayal people. And in order to be a member of the community, you actually have to be Atayal, and you have to be a member of their particular tribe. So membership of that community is determined explicitly by your ethnicity. And they live in a fairly remote mountain area. It has basically only one main access road, so they're able to control the number of people who come in. They rely on ecotourism. So it's not like they are complete separatists. It's not that they are attempting to separate themselves from the society in which they live in the sense of having nothing to do with them. They're not exclusionary in that regard. And of course, they rely on ecotourism. They invite people to come up. However, they do limit the number of tourists in order to maintain the quality of the local environment, so it's not too degraded by tourists, which again is just good ecological management. But in order to be a member of their community, you do need to be a member of their tribe. And that's a form of separatism. So they are living where they have always lived. They are not disenfranchising or dispossessing or oppressing any other group by doing so. They are living on their land, and all they want is sovereignty over their land and the right to live by themselves with other members of their community who belong to their tribe. Now, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to visit them. You can, and they are completely happy interacting with other people. And I believe that community absolutely has the right to do that. And I think that that's the kind of idea that Professor Flowers had in mind. And if that is indeed what she had in mind, I completely agree with it. Now, I will say that, generally speaking, I have a natural aversion to separatism and segregationism. However, Smangus is not fundamentally segregationist in this, or separationist in the exclusionary sense. They don't believe in having no contact with other ethnic groups. And in fact, although they educate their children in their own school, in their own village community, they do also provide funding to their children, for any of their children who want a university education, which obviously has to be done outside the community. So they pay for the university education of any of their children who want to leave the community and study at college, with the proviso that they must return so that the community can benefit from their knowledge. If one of their children has the university education paid for by the community and they choose not to return, then they must return their university fees to the community, which I believe is also fair. So they are not separatists or segregationists in the sense of believing that there should be no contact between groups and that these groups should be separated permanently or by force. So if that is what Professor Flowers had in mind, I have no objection to that. And again, I think from an anarchist point of view, it's difficult to have an objection to that. And you might say, well, anarchists don't believe in borders. That's fine, but does anybody have the right to live in a specific community? Can you approach a community and say, you must accept me into your community? I have the right to live with you, other people. You might say you have the right to live in this particular territory if you're of the belief that nobody fundamentally has the right to a piece of land. I think Dr. Heem has that idea. I think that's an issue he raised with Professor Flowers in his discussion. You might believe that nobody has the inherent right to a particular piece of territory. That's fine. But can you insist that other people must necessarily accept you into their community? From an anarchist perspective, I think that's a very difficult position to argue. And consequently, this means that indigenous people, colonized people, Aboriginal people have the right to create these groups. On the flip side, from an anarchist perspective, if we're going to take that as an established anarchist position within that framework, unfortunately, this means white separatists have the same right. Now, what I don't believe is that a group has the ability to separate themselves by force or to maintain their separation by force. And of course, this is where I believe that a white nationalist or white separatist group is inherently going to always result in a negative outcome, whereas people who are withdrawing from their colonizers, wishing to live mainly by themselves in order to escape the negative impacts of colonization, have a completely different motive. So I don't believe the outcomes will be the same. I don't believe all the outcomes will be the same, as long as they are maintaining some positive interaction with other members of other communities outside their own, in particular outside their ethnic group. I am very wary of ethnic segregation generally, and people growing up without regular contact with other ethnic groups. I think historically that always breeds distrust and xenophobia. I don't believe that Professor Flowers would insist on a hard no mixing rule or object to intermarriage or anything like that. So I think that actually more time should have been spent by Vaush and some of Professor Flowers' other interlocutors on teasing out exactly what her position was and on inviting her to provide more details from her perspective for how this would work out in practice. So from an anarchist perspective, that's how I see it. Over to you.
Okay, this is actually pretty interesting. I think we can get some solid conversation about this. So I think that you and me might slightly disagree on this. I remember once I saw, and everyone knows that I have plenty of issues with Vaush, but this is one area where I did kind of agree with him, where I remember once he was talking to like one of these white nationalist types, and he was like, well, why can't like a bunch of white people go out and start their own like ethno-state out in North Dakota or whatever? And he said, well, they can do that, but if black people want to move up there and live there, I think they have the right to do that. And I would abide by that standard. I think that if, for example, you wanted to go and live with that Christian anarchist tribe out in the mountains in Taiwan, I think you'd essentially have the right to do that. Because, like, in my view, if they have a right to freedom of association, to freedom of movement, to freedom to live wherever they want, so do you, or so do like the black people who might want to live in like that white area, although I don't imagine too many of them would, but at least in principle. And I also believe that just generally speaking, like super tight-knit ethnocentric ideals, I mean, I won't pretend that like they can't have any positive impact. Like it is possible, for example, that you might be able to foster like a stronger sense of community, but I'm still just kind of, it's not something I particularly like, because I think that it's important for us to spend time with people who are not like us, who have cultures that are different than us, that come from different parts of the world than we do, because I mean, it makes us learn more, frankly. It makes us smarter. It makes us smarter. It makes us more tolerant. It makes us less xenophobic. And like, that's kind of my like ideal for the world, that like one day we can live in a place where people of all different cultures can live together and build communities together. And we aren't divided by these like tribalistic notions of race or ethnicity or culture or identity, and we accept one another for who we are. Yeah,
that's what I was getting at before.
We live together. That's my vision of the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's what I was getting at before. I mean, I'm a strong believer in multiculturalism, and I don't see anything wrong in the idea of obviously groups mixing in together in those ways. I think that's incredibly healthy. I think that's necessary. As I said before, if a group wished to live separately in some sense, I would, as I mentioned previously, I would say it's necessary for the health of that community that they have regular social interaction with others in some way. and that they don't just simply put up a wall and saying, no whites allowed, this kind of thing. Now, with regard to that hypothetical white separatist group in Dakota, I would say that they are illegitimate simply because there is no way they could establish their community without dispossessing the indigenous people of the land.
That is true. That is true.
I don't believe they have any right to stride out into South Dakota, hammer down a palisade and say, well, this is ours now. I believe that if they want to get serious about their ethno-nationalism, then they need to return to the country of their ancestors' origin and stake out a claim there.
Yeah, they need to go back to Europe or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Go back to your own country.
I wouldn't really be in favor of that either, but at least it would kind of make sense.
Exactly. At least it would be more consistent. Like I said, if you want your weird little hard segregated white nationalist community, then go somewhere where you could legitimately say you belong to your ancestors. And at the same time, even though I have said I believe it's legitimate for a group to separate itself in some regard, and at least in anarchism, it's very difficult to argue against that if they are not dispossessing other people and not harming other people in the process. There is nevertheless the concept of consequences. Groups which separate themselves in various ways are going to provoke certain feelings and sentiments in other groups who will therefore either deal with them in a positive or negative way. I think the more separatist and segregationist any such community is, whether it's some white nationalist or white separatist group, which is obviously absolutely, I believe, morally and mentally doomed from the start, or whether it is a group of indigenous people wishing to separate themselves from their colonizers, the extent to which they separate themselves and to which they enforce some kind of segregation is going to have a positive or negative effect on others and is going to have consequences for the health of their community, not only the social health of their community, but frankly, the economic health of their community. There's no point being all nice separatist and segregationist if other people decide that, well, we don't like you and we're just not going to have any dealings with you economically. The world is increasingly connected, globalized. In these days, it's incredibly difficult to be completely independent. Even that group that I talked about, Kalangs Mangus, is to a very large extent self-dependent. They still rely significantly on socio-economic structures which tie them inextricably to the government, such as healthcare and, to a certain extent, education, but also important infrastructure, in particular electricity. So from that point of view, I believe that any such group is going to have their behavior somewhat regulated by the surrounding communities, regardless of the extent to which they want to maintain some kind of separation. The phrase "no man is an island" is particularly relevant these days.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that, despite some slight differences, I think we more or less agree on the basics here. I guess what I meant, my final question would be, I figured, let's say tomorrow I'm the president of the United States of America and you're,
right,
I don't know, the prime minister of Australia, and, we have to deal with this issue. What exactly do we do in terms of policy? Because ultimately, I think that's the most important. We can talk about theory and philosophy, and that's important. But as far as policy, what do we actually want to do? As far as what I would do, I would probably start some kind of reparations package towards Native Americans. I don't necessarily think that comes in the form of a stimulus check, but it probably comes in forms of general aid to reservations, general aid to struggling Native American communities, money going in to help Native Americans who are affected by certain issues, for example, alcoholism, which is a very big problem in Native American communities. With African Americans, I'd probably do about the same. I guess you could potentially make a moral argument that you could do it for Irish or Italian Americans, given their historic discrimination, but there's not really as much a need for it as there is for Native or African Americans. I would probably designate more land that is mostly lived on by Native Americans as tribal land. However, I would probably also have the caveat that they're not allowed to turn that land into an ethno-state or anything like that. I'd allow them to have more autonomy over their decisions. For example, for them to have more influence if, for example, there's a pipeline being built that they don't want on their land, or something some company is engaging in something that they don't want on their land. I think it's fine for the government to step in and say, hey, you can't do that. That would more or less be my policy going forward. I think that's the best way to handle this situation. Would your policy prescriptions be any different or not really?
Well, assuming we're operating under liberal democracy in that regard, of course, remembering that I'm an anarchist, I'm not particularly keen on talk of policy, but with regard to this issue, if we're taking for granted operating under a liberal democratic framework, then yeah, I would agree with that. I think there should be an absolute focus on dismantling the systemic structures which deprive colonized people of their independence. The group in Taiwan that I mentioned previously, Galangsmangus, have constantly faced issues with the government interfering with them and depriving them of their independence and depriving them of sovereignty over their own land. Land sovereignty is a very big issue in Taiwan, still a very big issue. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the land back campaign of the indigenous people here in Taiwan, the Aboriginal people in Taiwan, I should say. Just as an aside, for a lot of people, the terms indigenous and Aboriginal are synonyms, and in many places they are. But in Taiwan, people differentiate between indigenous people and Aboriginal people. So when I say Aboriginal people, I mean the people who have been here for literally thousands of years. There's an academic definition of indigenous people which includes criteria such as a historic connection to a land, a historically differentiated identity and culture and language, and historic oppression by a settler-colonized group. And from that perspective, there are people in Taiwan who are indigenous but who are not Aboriginal. They've only been here for several hundred years, but they are not Aboriginal. So I try and remember this distinction when I'm talking about Taiwan. So when I talk about Aboriginal people in Taiwan, that's who I'm referring to. And the government in Taiwan has been extremely, I won't say inept, extremely remiss in fulfilling its promises of land restoration and land sovereignty to the Aboriginal people here. But the Aboriginal land back campaign here has been explicitly inclusive. And when I say that, what I mean is that the way that they have, for want of a better term, marketed their campaign to the general public, they have been extremely good at assuring the descendants of colonizers and, of course, immigrants to Taiwan that land back and land sovereignty for Aboriginal people in Taiwan is not going to deprive anybody who is an immigrant or even descendant of colonizers of anything, that is not going to deprive anybody or dispossess anybody of, say, their private holdings. Okay, they are particularly interested in sovereignty over their own land, the land that they have at the moment, and they are far more interested in reclaiming from the government land that currently is owned by the government. They're not interested in knocking on your door and saying, give me your apartment, when there are thousands of hectares out there of their own historic territory, which is owned by the government. They're not interested in your apartment. They're interested in that territory. And they've been very effective at holding demonstrations and protests which have involved non-Aboriginal people and accumulating and attracting very large groups, hundreds, thousands of people even in some cases, of supporters, local Taiwanese supporters from the immigrant and indigenous Taiwanese groups who support them and who spend time with them and get to know them personally and who feel solidarity with them. And they've held, for example, craft exercises. You know, you can come and learn some Aboriginal painting or Aboriginal traditional handicraft, or join in with their singing and their music production. And they have a saying which they always used in Chinese, 没有人是局外人, and it means no one is an outsider, okay? Which is a particularly powerful phrase showing we want sovereignty over our territory and we want our land back from the government, but we are not kicking you out and we are not excluding you individuals, you people, you citizens. We are opposing the structures that have been forced on us. We are opposing the systemic oppression. We're opposing the political institutions of those settler colonizers, which continue to oppress us and deprive us of our rights and dispossess us of our land and traditional titles and way of life. And that has been a particularly effective strategy in bringing people onto their side. Now, I have the feeling that some leftists would think that this is too weak, insufficiently aggressive, too compromising, and too conciliatory. And frankly, I don't have any good words for those kinds of people. I think this is a very good strategy because they are asserting very strongly their sovereignty and their independence, whilst at the same time demonstrating exactly where the focus should be and who they are really opposing. They're opposing historic systems of oppression. They're opposing historic political institutions of violence. And they have no problem with immigrants or other people who are just simply living on the land through, for want of a better phrase, no fault of their own. And they invite them to live on the land with us. Now, Professor Flowers made this point as well, that there are plenty of indigenous people in North America who don't have any problem with non-indigenous people living on their land. They don't necessarily want to kick people out, and nobody's talking about that apart from perhaps a few fringe groups. So this talk of genocide, I think, and relating it necessarily to land back, isn't good faith talk in my opinion. I think that, generally speaking, Vaush treated Professor Flowers very badly in all of his exchanges. His follow-up was very defensive, and in some cases, I think, outright bad faith. He used extremist hypotheticals, and I don't think he made a very good attempt to reach common ground. Professor Flowers objected explicitly, personally, to genocide of any kind, stated she was not a separatist, and made a very strong distinction between these different concepts. We've dealt with ethno-state, ethno-nationalism, nationalism, and separatism, and also even the distinction between a nation and a state. So I think that this is an issue which has a lot more potential for good than people realize. And I think if on the side of people like Vaush, people drop their guards a little and start being more considerate about the needs of colonized people and thinking about how to integrate even communities which wish for a degree of separation, how to build a system in which that is possible so that those communities can still maintain what I would see as a socially and psychologically healthy interaction with other communities on their own terms, I think this would be a much, much better way forward. And I just didn't see Vaush doing that. And I would like to see more people doing that.
Yeah, pretty much entirely agree with that. I'll admit I haven't seen the Professor Flowers debate in a while, so I can't really speak to exactly how he performed. But I will say I do remember that not everything he said seemed entirely in good faith, and I have seen him more recently engage in certain debates that I would absolutely characterize as being bad faith, like his debate with R. Relevant,
right?
Over
absolutely,
the
absolutely,
House
yeah.
stuff.
Absolutely, I think R. Relevant had some very good concerns there, and again, I think Vaush leapt to hypotheticals,
more or less,
in an attempt to dodge the issue most of the time. And I think he never really addressed the question.
Yeah.
I mean, and then there was a lot of whataboutism, which I found particularly unpleasant.
Yeah, I would agree with like most of what you said. Definitely, as far as the Taiwanese independence movement. Yeah, I think that's kind of about it. Like, we kind of got to just about everything. I guess I don't know exactly what we'll be doing next week, but we'll definitely be doing something interesting.
I was just going to say a follow-up to this, which would be relevant and could be interesting, is the concept of decolonization and what it really means to live in a healthy post-colonial society.
That would be interesting. I'd be down for talking about that. I don't know if we'll do that this week, next week, or the week after.
Sure.
We'll talk about that after the show.
Great. Excellent.
But until then, I'm Man the Wall.
And I'm Veritas et Caritas.
And we'll see you next time.
Finally, many thanks to my generous patrons, Elias Asvig, Duran Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Sean A. Young, Andy Chaos, TBLTP, Thors, Niels Rethlin, Judge Sabo, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Martin T., Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Jack C., Ezekiel Stacey, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, and Dusty Bob. Thank you so much for your support, and please contact me if I ever pronounce your name